He found a bear cub hidden in a photography studio darkroom. What he did next developed hope. The red light bathed everything in a warm, drowsy glow that made the world feel like it existed underwater. And Ethan Marshall stood there in his darkroom, breathing in the familiar chemical smell that had become his second home over the past 15 years. His hands moved through the developer fluid with practiced ease, but his mind wandered somewhere else entirely. Somewhere far from the photographs hanging on the line above him, like ghosts of moments he'd captured but couldn't quite feel anymore. The creative drought had lasted 3 months now. 3 long months where every photograph felt hollow. Every image just another mechanical reproduction of light and shadow without soul, without that spark that used to make his heart race when he saw an image emerge from the blank paper. Outside the darkroom door, he could hear the soft gurgling sounds of his 6-month-old son Jacob in his carrier, those little noises babies make when they're content and exploring the world with their tiny hands. And Ethan had brought him to the studio today because Lily needed rest, needed just a few hours to herself after another sleepless night. The studio itself sat tucked away on the 3rd floor of an old brick building downtown. One of those places that had been everything from a textile factory to a dance hall before Ethan converted it into his sanctuary 5 years ago. The dark room occupied what used to be a storage closet, small and windowless, perfect for developing film in complete darkness, save for that single red safe light that painted everything in shades of crimson and shadow. Ethan reached for another print, watching it slowly materialize in the tray. Another landscape that felt empty despite its technical perfection, and he wondered not for the first time if maybe he'd lost whatever gift he once had, if maybe the well had finally run dry. The baby made another sound, this time a soft coo that seemed to echo strangely in the confined space, and Ethan turned to check on him through the partially open door, making sure the carrier was still secure on the desk outside where the regular lights wouldn't damage his developing prints. That's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong in his studio, a gentle rustling like leaves moving in a breeze that couldn't exist in this sealed room 3 stories up. Ethan froze, his hands still dripping with developer fluid, listening intently as the sound came again, softer this time, almost like breathing but not quite human, not quite anything he could identify. His first thought was that maybe a bird had somehow gotten in through the ventilation system, though he'd never had that problem before in all his years working here, and he carefully set down his tongs, wiping his hands on the stained apron he wore to protect his clothes from the chemicals. The sound seemed to be coming from the far corner of the darkroom, behind the shelves where he stored his older equipment, cameras he'd collected over the years but rarely used anymore, relics from an analog age that felt increasingly distant in this digital world. Moving slowly, not wanting to startle whatever creature had found its way into his space, Ethan peered around the metal shelving unit, and what he saw made him stop breathing entirely, made his mind struggle to process what his eyes were clearly showing him. There, nestled between an old Leica and a box of expired film, was a bear cub, but not like any bear cub that should exist in the real world, not like anything that belonged in a downtown photography studio 3 floors above the busy street. The creature was small, maybe the size of a house cat, and its fur seemed to shimmer in the red light, not quite solid, as if it were made of light itself, or maybe shadow given form, and when it breathed, Ethan could see tiny sparkles in the air around it, like dust motes catching sunlight, except there was no sunlight here, only that red safe light that made everything look like a dream, or a memory of a dream. The cub's eyes were closed, and it appeared to be sleeping, its tiny chest rising and falling with each breath, and Ethan found himself holding his own breath, afraid that any movement, any sound, might cause this impossible creature to vanish like smoke. took a step backward, his mind racing through explanations that made no sense, wondering if maybe the developer chemicals were affecting him somehow, if maybe he was hallucinating from the fumes, though he'd never had that problem before. Always kept the ventilation fan running just like he was supposed to. But the cub remained there, solid enough to cast a shadow, real enough that he could see individual hairs in its fur catching the red light. And Ethan slowly reached for his phone, thinking he should call someone, though he had no idea who you called when you found an impossible bear cub in your dark room. Before he could unlock his phone, Jacob made another sound from outside the dark room. A happy babbling that seemed louder now, more insistent, and the cub's eyes opened. They were the most extraordinary eyes Ethan had ever seen. Not quite any color he could name, shifting between gold and silver, and something that reminded him of starlight. And the creature looked directly at him with an intelligence that seemed both ancient and newborn at the same time. The cub didn't seem afraid, didn't growl or show any signs of aggression, just watched him with those impossible eyes, and then, moving with a grace that seemed to defy physics, it stood and walked past him. Not quickly, not running away, just walking with purpose toward the door where Jacob's sounds were growing more excited. Ethan followed, his legs moving without conscious thought, and he watched as the cub approached his son's carrier, watched as Jacob's tiny hands reached out toward the creature with the fearless curiosity that only babies possess. The cub sniffed at the baby's fingers, and Jacob laughed, a pure, delighted sound that Ethan hadn't heard him make before. And the photographer in him desperately wanted to capture this moment, even as the father in him wondered if he should intervene, if he should protect his child from this inexplicable visitor. But there was something in the way the cub moved, something gentle and careful, almost protective, that made Ethan stay where he was, watching as his son and this impossible creature seemed to communicate in a language that needed no words. The studio door opened then, and Lily walked in carrying coffee and looking tired but smiling, saying something about how she couldn't stay away, how the house felt too quiet without them. And then she saw the cub, and the coffee cups fell from her hands, shattering on the wooden floor in a splash of brown liquid and white ceramic. But she didn't scream, didn't run, just stood there with her mouth open, watching as the bear cub gently nuzzled Jacob's outstretched hand, and the baby giggled again. That same pure sound of joy that seemed to fill the entire studio with light, despite the late afternoon shadows creeping through the windows. Lily looked at Ethan, her eyes wide with questions he couldn't answer, and he shook his head slightly, trying to convey that he was just as confused, just as amazed as she was. "What is it?" she whispered, moving closer with careful steps, avoiding the broken cups and spilled coffee. And Ethan noticed that her artist's eye was already studying the creature, taking in details that his photographer's mind had been cataloging since the moment he'd discovered it. The way the cub's fur seemed to contain depth, like looking into a clear night sky, the way its breath created those tiny sparkles that hung in the air for just a moment before disappearing, the way it moved with a fluidity that reminded him of water or wind made visible. Lily reached out her hand slowly, and the cub turned to look at her with those color-shifting eyes, and she gasped softly when it pressed its small head against her palm, warm and solid and impossibly soft. They stood there, the three of them and this creature that shouldn't exist, in a moment that felt suspended outside of time, outside of the normal rules that governed the world. Jacob continued to make happy sounds, reaching for the cub with both hands now, and the creature moved closer to the carrier, careful not to knock it over, positioning itself where the baby could touch its fur. Ethan found himself thinking about all the photographs he'd taken over the years, all the moments he'd tried to capture and preserve, and realized that none of them came close to the raw beauty of what was happening right now. This intersection of the impossible and the everyday, this meeting between his infant son and something that belonged in fairy tales or dreams. "Should we call someone?" Lily asked, though her voice suggested she didn't really want to, didn't want to break whatever spell had been cast over their small studio. Ethan thought about animal control or the police or even a veterinarian, but what would he say? That there was a magical bear cub in his darkroom that seemed to be made of light and shadow. That his baby son had somehow summoned or attracted this creature that defied every law of nature he understood. Instead, he shook his head and moved to get his camera, not the digital one he used for most of his work now, but the old film camera, the one he'd learned on 20 years ago when he was just starting out. The cub watched him as he loaded the film, those strange eyes following his movements with what seemed like understanding, maybe even approval. When he raised the camera, the creature didn't flee or hide, just continued to sit there next to Jacob's carrier, one small paw resting near the baby's hand, and Ethan took the photograph, hearing the mechanical click of the shutter that had always sounded like capturing a heartbeat to him. He took another and another, moving around to different angles, and the cub remained still, patient, as if it understood the importance of being documented, of leaving proof that this moment had really happened. As the afternoon light began to fade, painting the studio in shades of gold and amber that mixed with the red light still spilling from the dark room, Ethan noticed something strange about the cub's fur. Where the different lights touched it, he could see patterns, almost like constellations, tiny points of brightness connected by threads of light so faint he wasn't sure if he was really seeing them or if his eyes were creating patterns where none existed. Lily saw it too. He could tell by the way she leaned closer, squinting slightly, and she whispered that it looked like the night sky they'd seen on their camping trip last summer, when they'd driven far from the city lights and lay on their backs watching the Milky Way spin overhead. The cub made a sound then, the first vocalization they'd heard from it, a soft rumbling that wasn't quite a purr and wasn't quite a growl, something that seemed to resonate in their chests rather than their ears. Jacob responded with his own sound, a babbling stream of baby talk that rose and fell like music, and the cub tilted its head, listening intently as if the baby was sharing secrets of the universe in a language only they could understand. Ethan found himself setting down the camera, drawn into the moment beyond his need to document it, and he sat on the floor next to Lily, both of them watching this impossible conversation between their son and the Star Bear, as Lily had started calling it in her mind. Time moved strangely in the studio that afternoon, sometimes seeming to slow to a crawl where Ethan could count the individual sparkles floating around the cub, sometimes jumping forward so that suddenly the light had changed and he couldn't remember the last few minutes clearly. The cub never showed any signs of aggression or fear, never made any sudden movements that might startle the baby, just maintained that gentle presence that felt both protective and curious. At one point, it walked over to the dark room and peered inside, and Ethan followed, watching as it sniffed at the developing trays, at the photographs hanging on the line, and he could have sworn he saw recognition in its eyes when it looked at one particular image, a long exposure shot of the night sky he'd taken months ago during the meteor shower. That's when the first strange thing happened, or rather, the first strange thing beyond the existence of the cub itself. The photograph it had been looking at began to glow, not dramatically, not like a light bulb, but with a soft luminescence that seemed to come from within the paper itself. The image showed a streak of meteors across a dark sky, and now those streaks seemed to be moving, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely moving across the photograph's surface. The cub made that rumbling sound again, and the glow intensified slightly. and Ethan reached out to touch the photograph, half expecting to feel heat, but it was cool to the touch. Cool and tingling, like touching snow with bare fingers. Lily had joined them in the darkroom, Jacob secure in her arms, and she gasped when she saw the glowing photograph. The baby reached toward it, making excited sounds, and the cub moved closer to them, pressing against Lily's leg like a house cat seeking affection. She looked down at it, then at the photograph, then at Ethan, and he could see the same mixture of wonder and confusion in her eyes that he felt in his own chest. "What do you think it wants?" she asked, and Ethan realized he'd been thinking of the cub as an it, when clearly this was a being with purpose, with intention, maybe even with needs they couldn't understand. He looked around the darkroom, at all his equipment, at the photographs he'd developed over the years, and wondered if maybe the cub had been drawn here by something specific, by some quality of the space, or the images, or even the chemicals. The thought seemed absurd, but no more absurd than the creature's existence in the first place, and he found himself speaking his thoughts aloud, telling Lily about how he'd been feeling creatively dead, how every photograph had felt empty lately, and how the appearance of this impossible creature felt like an answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask. She listened, shifting Jacob to her other arm when he got heavy, and the cub continued to watch the glowing photograph, occasionally making that soft rumbling sound that seemed to make the image pulse with light. As the evening deepened outside, they realized they needed to make decisions about practical things, like whether to leave the studio, whether to tell anyone about their visitor, whether to try to feed it or give it water. The cub solved the last problem by walking to the small sink in the corner of the darkroom and looking at them expectantly, and when Ethan turned on the tap, it drank delicately, its pink tongue darting out to catch the stream of water. It didn't seem to need food, showed no interest when Lily offered it part of her forgotten sandwich from her bag, just returned to its position near Jacob, who had started to get sleepy, his eyelids drooping despite his obvious fascination with their guest. They decided to stay in the studio that night, neither of them willing to leave and risk the cub disappearing, both of them feeling like they were part of something important even if they couldn't define what it was. Ethan pulled out the old couch he kept for long editing sessions, and Lily settled there with Jacob, who fell asleep almost immediately, one tiny hand still reaching toward where the cub had curled up on the floor nearby. The creature's breathing had synchronized with the baby's, both of them inhaling and exhaling in perfect rhythm. And those sparkles continued to drift through the air around them, catching the last rays of sunlight through the window like a snow globe filled with stars. As darkness fell completely, something extraordinary happened. The cub began to glow, not brightly, not enough to hurt their eyes, but with the same soft luminescence as the photograph in the dark room. Its fur revealed those constellation patterns more clearly now. Actual star formations that Ethan recognized from his astronomy photography phase, Orion and Cassiopeia and the Pleiades all mapped across the small creature's body. Lily gasped softly, not wanting to wake Jacob, and pointed to a cluster of stars on the cub's shoulder that looked exactly like the birthmark on their son's back, the same random pattern of dots that the pediatrician had assured them was completely normal, but that now seemed anything but random. The connection between Jacob and the cub became more apparent as the night wore on. When the baby stirred in his sleep, the cub's glow would pulse gently, and Jacob would settle again. When the cub shifted position, Jacob would make a small sound, not distressed, just acknowledging the movement even in his dreams. Ethan found himself thinking about quantum entanglement, about particles that remained connected across vast distances, affecting each other instantaneously regardless of the space between them. He shared this thought with Lily, who was still awake, still watching their son and the star bear with the focus she usually reserved for her paintings, and she nodded slowly, saying it felt like they were witnessing something that existed at the intersection of science and magic. Something that didn't need to be fully understood to be real. Around midnight, Ethan returned to the dark room to check on the glowing photograph and found that it had changed. The meteor streaks were gone, replaced by an image he didn't remember taking, couldn't have taken, because it showed the studio from above, from an impossible angle, with him and Lily and Jacob and the cub all visible, all surrounded by threads of light that connected them like a web. He called Lily in quietly, and she stared at the transformed photograph, reaching out to touch it gently. And when her finger made contact, the image rippled like water, showing them different moments. The cub in the dark room corner, Jacob laughing, themselves standing in wonder, all happening simultaneously in the same frame. "It's showing us the story," Lily whispered, and Ethan understood what she meant. The photograph wasn't just documenting what had happened, it was revealing the connections, the patterns that linked this moment to something larger. He thought about all the photographs he'd taken over the years, wondering how many of them contained hidden depths he'd never noticed, wondering if the cub had always been there in some form, waiting in the shadows of his images for the right moment to emerge. The idea should have been frightening, but instead it filled him with a sense of purpose he'd been missing, a feeling that his work, his art, was part of something greater than just capturing light and shadow. They spent the rest of the night taking turns watching over Jacob and the cub, though neither seemed to need watching, both perfectly content in each other's presence. Sometimes the cub would open those color-shifting eyes and look at them. And in those moments Ethan felt like he was being seen completely, not judged, just observed with a depth of understanding that made him want to be better, to create better, to see the world with the same patient wisdom he saw in those impossible eyes. Lily sketched continuously in her notebook, trying to capture the way the light moved around the creature, the way its fur seemed to contain entire galaxies. And she showed Ethan her drawings, which somehow managed to convey the feeling of the cub's presence even if they couldn't quite capture its physical form. As dawn approached, the cub stood and stretched, its movements fluid and graceful, and walked back to the dark room. They followed, Lily carrying the still sleeping Jacob, and watched as the creature approached the wall where Ethan kept his favorite photographs, the ones that meant the most to him personally rather than professionally. It stopped in front of one particular image, a photograph of the night sky he'd taken the day he'd learned Lily was pregnant, when he'd driven out to the desert alone to process the news and had ended up lying on his back for hours, camera pointed straight up, capturing long exposures of the stars wheeling overhead. The cub touched its nose to the photograph, and the image began to glow like the other one had. But this time the light spread outward, encompassing the entire wall, then the room, then everything. Ethan felt no fear, only a sense of completion, of understanding, as the light revealed connections he'd never seen before. Threads linking every photograph he'd ever taken, every moment he'd captured, creating a vast web of interconnected instants that told a story larger than any individual image. He saw his life's work not as separate pieces but as one continuous exploration of light and time and meaning, and at the center of it all was this moment, this impossible visit from a creature that might have been born from his photographs, or might have been waiting in them all along. Jacob woke then, his eyes opening to take in the light-filled room, and he laughed, that pure, delighted sound that seemed to harmonize with the humming that filled the air. A sound Ethan realized was coming from the photographs themselves, from the captured moments resonating with whatever energy the cub had awakened. The baby reached for the cub, and the creature moved closer, allowing the tiny hands to touch its glowing fur one more time. And in that touch, Ethan saw something pass between them. Not knowledge exactly, but possibility, potential. A promise that the world was far more magical than anyone suspected, and that Jacob would grow up knowing this truth in his bones. The light began to fade slowly, gradually, like the sun setting in reverse, and the cub's physical form began to fade with it. But it wasn't disappearing so much as dispersing, spreading out, becoming part of the photographs, part of the studio, part of the very air they breathed. Ethan wanted to ask it to stay, wanted to beg it not to leave them. But he understood somehow that this was always how it was meant to happen, that the cub's visit was like a photograph itself, a moment captured and preserved, but not meant to last forever in its physical form. Lily was crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she held Jacob close, but she was smiling too, the kind of smile that comes from witnessing something so beautiful it changes you forever. As the last of the cub's visible form dissolved into sparkles of light that drifted through the studio like snow, Ethan noticed something new on the wall of photographs. There was an image he'd never taken, never developed, showing a bear cub made of stars walking through a dark room, and in the corner of the frame, barely visible, was the suggestion of a baby's hand reaching out in wonder. The photograph was labeled in handwriting he didn't recognize, maybe his own, maybe Lily's, maybe neither. The day hope developed. He touched the image gently and felt warmth, felt that rumbling purr that had resonated in his chest, and knew that the cub hadn't really left, had simply transformed into something they could carry with them always. Jacob was babbling excitedly now, his baby talk seeming more purposeful than before, and Lily swore she could almost understand him, could almost hear him describing the friend who lived in the light. The bear made of stars who had come to show them something important. They spent the morning in the studio, not wanting to leave just yet, not wanting to step back into a world that didn't know what they now knew. Ethan developed the photographs he'd taken of the cub on film, and was amazed to find that each one showed something different. The creature appearing sometimes solid, sometimes translucent, sometimes seeming to exist in multiple places at once within the same frame. By the time they finally left the studio that afternoon, something fundamental had changed in all of them. Ethan's creative block had vanished completely, replaced by an overwhelming urge to photograph everything, to look for the hidden connections and impossible moments that he now knew existed everywhere. Lily's paintings over the coming weeks would take on a new quality, a luminescence that critics would struggle to define, calling it capturing the light between lights. And Jacob, as he grew, would always seem to see more than others, would point at empty spaces and laugh, would draw pictures of bears made of stars that his preschool teachers would frame and wonder about. The story of the Star Bear, as they came to call it privately between themselves, became a family secret and a family truth. They never tried to explain it to others, knowing how it would sound, but sometimes, in Ethan's photographs or Lily's paintings, others would see hints of something more, would feel that rumbling purr in their chests when they looked at certain images, would walk away feeling like the world was bigger and more beautiful than they'd realized. The darkroom photograph that had transformed itself continued to change subtly over time, showing different moments from that night, sometimes revealing details they hadn't noticed, like the way the air itself had been filled with tiny threads of light, or the way their own bodies had glowed faintly in response to the cub's presence. Ethan found that his photography had taken on a new dimension, that he could somehow sense the moments when the ordinary world touched something extraordinary, and he would be there with his camera, ready to capture these intersections. His exhibition 6 months later, titled Developed Hope, would become his most successful, though critics would struggle to explain why the images seemed to move, seemed to breathe, seemed to contain depths that shouldn't be possible in two-dimensional prints. Several visitors to the gallery would report seeing a small bear cub in their peripheral vision while viewing the photographs, though it would vanish when they turned to look directly. The original photograph from the darkroom, the one of the night sky that had first attracted the cub's attention, Ethan had framed and hung in Jacob's nursery. Sometimes, late at night, they would find their son standing in his crib, reaching toward it and babbling happily, and the image would be glowing softly, just enough to cast star patterns on the ceiling. They never worried about Jacob when this happened, understanding that the connection formed that day in the studio was permanent, protective, a gift from a universe that was far stranger and more wonderful than anyone suspected. Years later, when Jacob was old enough to understand, they would tell him the story properly, and he would nod as if he'd always known it, as if the memory lived in his cells rather than his mind. He would become an astronomer, surprising no one, and would discover a new constellation that looked remarkably like a small bear, though he would never publicly mention that he'd been drawing that exact pattern since before he could properly hold a crayon. The constellation would be named after him, Jacob's Bear, and in the official photographs, those with the right eyes could see it seemed to pulse with a familiar light, seemed to contain depths that shouldn't exist in distant stars. But all of that was still to come. In the immediate aftermath of the cub's visit, Ethan and Lily simply held their son and each other, knowing they had been given a gift beyond measure. They would return to the studio every day, and while the cub never appeared in its physical form again, they would find evidence of its presence. Sparkles in the air that lasted longer than dust should. Photographs that developed themselves in the darkroom overnight, showing scenes of beauty they hadn't captured. And always, that sense of being part of something larger, something that connected every moment to every other moment in an infinite web of possibility. The world continued as it always had. People rushing through their days, missing the magic that existed in every shadow, in every beam of light, in every moment where the impossible touched the ordinary. But for one family, the veil had been lifted, however briefly, and they had seen the truth that hope wasn't just an emotion or an idea, but something that could develop like a photograph in a darkroom, something that could take form and walk among us, something that could be born from the intersection of love and art and wonder. And in a world that often seemed dark, that knowledge was its own kind of light, spreading outward from their small studio in ripples that would touch lives in ways they would never fully know. If you're enjoying this story of wonder and mystery, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Your support helps us share more of these extraordinary tales that remind us of the magic hidden in everyday moments. Now, let's continue with this remarkable journey. The morning after the cub's visit had transformed into pure light. Ethan found himself drawn back to the darkroom before dawn, unable to sleep, his mind churning with questions and possibilities. The red safe light seemed different now, seemed to pulse with a rhythm he hadn't noticed before, like a heartbeat or like breathing. And when he looked at the photographs hanging on the line, he saw they had all changed subtly. Each image now contained tiny points of light that hadn't been there before, constellation patterns hidden in the shadows. Threads connecting elements he'd never noticed were related. A portrait of an elderly man showed stars in the wrinkles around his eyes. A landscape of the desert revealed celestial maps in the sand patterns, and every photograph seemed to tell two stories now, the one he'd intended to capture, and another deeper narrative about connection and continuity. Lily found him there an hour later, Jacob in her arms, the baby unusually alert for such an early hour, his eyes tracking something invisible through the air. She didn't ask why he was there, didn't need to, because she'd been feeling the same pull, The same need to return to the place where their understanding of the world had shifted so fundamentally. They stood together in the dark room, watching the photographs seem to breathe in the red light, and Lily pointed out something Ethan hadn't noticed, that the sparkles the cub had left behind hadn't disappeared, but had settled into the corners, into the spaces between things, creating a permanent shimmer that made the room feel alive in a way it never had before. Over the following days, they discovered that the transformation wasn't limited to the darkroom or the studio. Everywhere they went, they saw the connections the cub had revealed, saw the threads of light that linked people to each other, to places, to moments in time. It wasn't overwhelming or distracting, just a gentle awareness that existed at the edge of perception. Like knowing the sun is there, even when your eyes are closed. Jacob seemed especially attuned to these connections, would reach out toward empty air and laugh when his hand passed through invisible threads only he could fully see, would babble excitedly when they passed certain places or people, as if recognizing friends he'd never met. Ethan's photography transformed completely in those weeks following the visit. He found he could sense when a moment was about to become extraordinary, when the ordinary world was about to reveal its hidden depths, and he would raise his camera just in time to capture people's faces at the instant they remembered something beautiful, or the way light fell just as a bird took flight, or the second when strangers' eyes met and recognized something familiar in each other. His photographs began to tell stories that unfolded over time, viewers reporting that the images seemed different each time they looked at them, revealing new details, new connections, new meanings that emerged like developed film from the chemical bath of attention. The photograph of the star bear that had appeared on the wall became a kind of shrine for them, though they'd never use that word. Sometimes they would find small offerings left by its frame, things Jacob had somehow managed to place there despite not being able to reach that high. A flower that stayed fresh far longer than it should, a feather that seemed to contain all colors when held to the light, a stone that was warm to the touch no matter how cold the room. They never questioned how these things appeared, understanding that some mysteries were meant to be accepted rather than solved, that the how was less important than the why, and the why was always the same: love and wonder and connection. One evening, about 2 weeks after the visit, they had their first real test of how much the world had changed for them. Jacob developed a fever. Nothing serious, the doctor said, just a normal childhood illness, but he was miserable, crying in a way that broke their hearts, unable to sleep or eat. They tried everything, medicines and cool cloths and gentle rocking, but nothing helped until Ethan, acting on instinct, carried the baby into the dark room and held him under the red light. Immediately, Jacob calmed, his eyes focusing on something they couldn't see, and then the sparkles appeared. More visible than they'd been since the cub's visit, swirling around the baby like a gentle storm of stars. The fever broke within minutes, Jacob's skin cooling, his crying stopping, replaced by that familiar babbling that sounded like he was having a conversation with an old friend. They stayed in the darkroom for an hour, watching the sparkles dance around their son, feeling that familiar rumbling purr in their chests, and when they finally emerged, Jacob was completely well, playing with his toys as if he'd never been sick at all. The doctor, when they called to follow up, was puzzled but pleased, saying sometimes children recovered quickly from these things, though he'd never seen it happen quite that fast. They didn't try to explain, knowing how it would sound, but they understood that the cub's gift wasn't just wonder, but protection, a lasting connection that would watch over their son in ways they were only beginning to understand. Lily's art underwent its own transformation during this period. Her paintings began to glow with an inner light that couldn't be explained by technique or materials. and she found herself painting scenes she'd never witnessed, landscapes that might exist on other worlds, portraits of people she'd never met but who felt familiar. And always, somewhere in each painting, there was a suggestion of a small bear made of stars, sometimes obvious, sometimes hidden so well that only those who knew to look would find it. Her gallery was confused but delighted when her new work sold out within days of being displayed. Buyers saying they felt drawn to the paintings in ways they couldn't explain, felt like they were looking through windows into a world they'd forgotten existed. The studio itself became a different kind of space. Still a place of work, but also something more. A sanctuary where the boundaries between the possible and impossible were permanently blurred. Other photographers who rented time there began reporting strange experiences, not frightening but wonderful. Equipment working better than it should, photographs developing with qualities they hadn't intended, but that improved the images immeasurably, and always, that feeling of being watched over by something benevolent and patient. Some of them started calling it the Lucky Studio, though Ethan and Lily knew luck had nothing to do with it, that what people were experiencing was the residual presence of wonder, the lasting effect of a visit from something that had shown them the world was far more magical than anyone dared believe. 3 months after the visit, they received their first real confirmation that others had experienced something similar. A woman came to the studio, having heard about Ethan's exhibition, carrying a photograph from 1947 that her grandmother had taken. The image showed a forest clearing, and there in the background, barely visible but undeniably present, was a small bear-like figure that seemed to be made of light. The woman's grandmother had insisted until her dying day that she'd seen something magical in those woods, something that had changed her life, but no one had believed her until now. Ethan and Lily studied the photograph, seeing the same quality of light, the same impossible depth, and knew that the Star Bear, or others like it, had been visiting people throughout history, choosing moments and individuals for reasons they might never fully understand. They began collecting these stories, these images, creating a private archive of impossible visits and transformed lives. A painter from the 1800s whose work had suddenly taken on an otherworldly quality after reporting a strange encounter in his studio. A photographer from the 1960s whose images of the moon landing contained inexplicable lights that NASA couldn't explain. A child's drawing from last year showing a bear made of stars playing with children at a playground where several parents had reported seeing something unusual but had dismissed it as a trick of the light. Each story, each image, added to their understanding that what had happened to them was part of something larger. A pattern of contact between the ordinary world and something far more vast and beautiful. Jacob grew surrounded by this expanded understanding of reality, taking his first steps in the studio where the Star Bear had walked, saying his first clear word while pointing at the photograph on the wall, "Bear," though Ethan and Lily heard layers of meaning in that single syllable that went far beyond naming an animal. He drew before he could write, creating images that shouldn't have been possible for a child his age, complex patterns that resembled star charts and atomic structures, and the branching of rivers all at once. His preschool teachers were amazed and slightly unnerved, reporting that other children seemed drawn to him, would sit quietly while he drew, watching with the same rapt attention people gave to Ethan's photographs or Lily's paintings. The dark room became Jacob's favorite place as he grew older, not to develop photographs. He was still too young for the chemicals, but just to sit in the red light and watch the sparkles that never quite went away. Sometimes Ethan would find him there having one-sided conversations, except they didn't feel one-sided, felt like Jacob was listening to responses only he could hear, learning things that he would later demonstrate in surprising ways. Like the time he accurately predicted a meteor shower that astronomers hadn't expected, or when he drew a picture of a new playground before the city had announced plans to build it exactly where and how he'd drawn it, or when he told them not to worry about Lily's mother's illness weeks before she was diagnosed because the star friends say she'll be okay, which she was, recovering completely from something the doctors had said would be terminal. 5 years passed, and the immediate memory of that night began to feel both more distant and more present, like a dream that becomes more real the longer you're awake. Ethan's photography had earned him international recognition, though he could never quite explain his methods to other photographers who wanted to learn his techniques. How could he tell them that he didn't take photographs so much as receive them, that he'd learned to see the moments when the universe wanted to reveal itself, and his job was simply to be ready? His workshops became legendary, not for what he taught, but for what happened to the participants, many reporting breakthrough moments in their own art, a sudden understanding of connections they'd never seen before, and always at least one person would quietly approach him afterward to share their own impossible story, their own encounter with something that had changed their understanding of what was real. Lily's paintings had evolved into something that art critics struggled to categorize, calling it luminous realism or transcendent naturalism. But these labels failed to capture what viewers experienced standing in front of her canvases. People would often cry without knowing why, would stand transfixed for hours, would return day after day to look at the same painting and swear it had changed, shown them something new. She painted what she saw, the world as it really was once you knew how to look. Layers of connection and meaning that existed just beneath the surface of everyday experience. And in every painting, for those who knew how to see it, was the signature of the star bear, sometimes in the actual shape hidden in clouds or leaves, sometimes just in the quality of light that recalled that night in the studio when wonder had walked among them on 4 paws. Jacob started school with an understanding of the world that set him apart, not in a way that isolated him, but in a way that drew others to him, like moths to a flame. He had a quality that teachers couldn't quite define, a calmness and confidence that seemed unusual in a child, as if he knew secrets about the universe that eliminated the usual childhood fears and anxieties. He didn't talk about the star bear at school, had learned early that some truths were too large for casual conversation, but his drawings and stories always contained hints, threads of light connecting characters, animals that weren't quite animals, skies that held more than just stars. The photograph on the darkroom wall, the one that had appeared the night of the visit, continued to evolve. Sometimes it showed the cub clearly, sometimes just suggestions of its presence, and occasionally, on significant days like Jacob's birthday or the anniversary of the visit, it would glow so brightly that the red safe light wasn't necessary, the image itself providing all the illumination the darkroom needed. They would find Jacob there on those nights sitting cross-legged on the floor, looking up at the photograph with an expression of such peace and understanding that it made them wonder what he saw that they couldn't, what conversations were happening in frequencies beyond their ability to hear. One night, when Jacob was 7, they woke to find him not in his bed, but in the studio, standing in front of the photograph with his hand pressed against it. The image was glowing brighter than they'd ever seen it, and Jacob was glowing too, a soft light emanating from his skin that made him look like he was made of the same substance as the star bear had been. When he noticed them, he smiled and said simply, "It's time for the next part." And as they watched, the photograph began to change. The image of the cub walking through the darkroom, dissolving and reforming into something new, a vast web of light connecting not just their studio but points all over the world, all over the universe, with their small family at one of the intersection points. They understood then that the visit hadn't been random, hadn't been a singular event, but was part of something immense and ongoing. a network of connection and consciousness that included anyone who had ever been touched by wonder, anyone who had ever seen through the veil of ordinary reality to the magic beneath. The Star Bear had been an ambassador, a messenger, a gift from this larger reality, come to activate something in them that had always been there, waiting. And now Jacob, their son who had been marked by starlight from 6 months old, was part of this network in a way they were only beginning to understand. The photograph settled into its new form, showing what looked like a map made of light, with points glowing brighter and dimmer in patterns that seemed to follow some cosmic rhythm. Jacob explained, in the matter-of-fact way children have when discussing the impossible, that each point was someone who had been visited, someone who had been awakened to the deeper nature of reality, and that their job was to help others see, not by telling them, that rarely worked, but by creating art that carried the frequency of wonder, that could activate the sleeping recognition in others that the world was far more than it seemed. From that night forward, their work took on an even deeper purpose. Ethan's photographs became more than art, became invitations to see differently, each image a doorway for those ready to walk through. Lily's paintings grew even more luminous, viewers reporting experiences that bordered on the mystical, seeing loved ones who had passed in the brushstrokes, finding answers to questions they hadn't known they were asking, feeling a presence that reminded them of childhood dreams of flying or talking to animals or understanding the language of stars. And Jacob, as he grew, became something none of them had expected, a teacher who never taught, a guide who never led, simply a presence that reminded others of what they'd always known but forgotten. The studio became a pilgrimage site of sorts, though never officially, never advertised. People would just show up, drawn by something they couldn't explain, and Ethan and Lily would let them sit in the darkroom, let them look at the photographs, let them experience whatever they needed to experience. Many left unchanged, unable or unwilling to see beyond the surface, but some left transformed, carrying with them a new understanding that would ripple out through their own lives and work, spreading the recognition that wonder wasn't childish or naive, but was perhaps the most sophisticated response to a universe that was itself made of consciousness and connection, and love expressing itself as matter and energy and time. 10 years after the original visit, on a night when the meteor shower Jacob had predicted as a toddler was at its peak, they gathered in the studio as a family. Jacob was now approaching his 11th birthday, tall for his age, with eyes that held depths that sometimes made adults uncomfortable, though children were always drawn to him. They sat in the dark room, the red light unnecessary because the photograph was glowing with its own illumination, and Jacob said he had something to show them. He placed his hand on the photograph, and suddenly the room filled with the familiar sparkles, but more than before a blizzard of light that coalesced slowly into a familiar form. The Star Bear stood before them again, not fully physical but more present than a projection, its eyes the same color-shifting wonder they remembered. It looked at each of them in turn, and they felt its greeting not in words but in that deep rumbling that resonated in their bones. Then it turned to Jacob and did something that looked like a bow, a recognition of what he had become, what he was becoming. Jacob bowed back, and in that exchange, Ethan and Lily saw that their son had grown into something they didn't have words for. Not inhuman, but more than human, or perhaps simply human in the fullest sense, connected to the vast web of consciousness that most people never knew existed. The cub didn't stay long this time, just long enough to remind them that it had never really left, that separation was an illusion created by limited perception, that everything that had ever existed was still present in every moment if you knew how to look. As it faded back into sparkles, back into potential, Jacob turned to his parents with tears streaming down his face, but he was smiling, the kind of smile that contained universes. "Do you understand now?" he asked, and they did, finally, fully, that the visit hadn't been about the Star Bear at all, but about awakening them to what was always there. The magic that lived in every atom, every photon, every heartbeat, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be developed like a photograph in the darkroom of consciousness. 2 chapters of Part 1 completed. The years that followed Jacob's revelation in the darkroom took on a quality of deepening rather than simple forward movement through time, as if each day added layers to their understanding rather than just passing by. Ethan found that his photographs had begun to do something unprecedented in the art world. They seemed to age in reverse, becoming more vivid and meaningful the older they got, as if they were developing not just in the chemical baths of the darkroom, but in the consciousness of everyone who viewed them. Gallery owners reported that paintings and photographs they'd had for years would suddenly seem to come alive, revealing details that couldn't have been there before, showing scenes within scenes like nested Russian dolls made of light and meaning. Jacob's education became a curious thing, his teachers consistently reporting that while he excelled at everything, he seemed to be learning from some source beyond their curriculum. He would write essays about mathematical concepts that wouldn't be taught until college, but explain them through metaphors of starlight and connection that made them understandable to his younger classmates. His science projects invariably involved demonstrations of principles that seemed to bend the rules slightly, like the time he created a camera obscura that somehow showed not just the inverted image of the outside world, but also faint traces of what had been there yesterday and what might be there tomorrow, though his teacher dismissed these additional images as clever double exposures. Lily's art had evolved beyond painting into something that defied categorization. She had begun creating installations that seemed to breathe, rooms filled with canvases and sculptures that interacted with the viewers in ways that couldn't be explained by traditional physics. People would enter her exhibitions and find that the art seemed to respond to their presence, colors shifting to match their moods, shapes reforming to show them something they needed to see. One critic, attempting to explain the phenomenon, suggested it was elaborate projection mapping and hidden sensors. But when technicians came to study the installations, they found nothing but traditional paint and canvas and clay. Yet the effects continued, stronger than ever, as if the attempt to explain them had only amplified their mystery. The darkroom photograph had become something of a legend in certain circles, though Ethan and Lily were careful about who they allowed to see it. It wasn't that they wanted to hoard the wonder, but they'd learned that not everyone was ready for that level of truth, that forcing awareness before its time could do more harm than good. But for those who were ready, sitting in the darkroom with that glowing image was transformative. They would emerge hours later, though they'd swear only minutes had passed, with a look in their eyes that Ethan recognized from his mirror the morning after the Star Bear's first visit. A look that said the world would never be quite the same again. One autumn evening, when Jacob was 13, he brought home a friend from school, a quiet girl named Sarah who had recently moved to town. She was shy, barely speaking above a whisper, and her parents had confided to Ethan and Lily that she'd been struggling since the move, having nightmares, refusing to engage with her new environment. Jacob had simply announced that morning that Sarah needed to see the darkroom, and his parents had learned to trust these pronouncements. When the girl entered the red-lit space, she gasped, not in fear, but in recognition, and pointed to the corner where the Star Bear had first appeared. "I've seen it," she whispered, the first clear words she'd spoken in their presence. "In my dreams, it's been trying to tell me something." What followed was remarkable, even by their standards. Sarah sat in the darkroom for 3 hours, Jacob beside her, neither of them speaking aloud but clearly communicating in some way that bypassed ordinary language. The sparkles that had become a permanent feature of the room grew denser around her, swirling in patterns that looked like galaxies being born. When she finally stood to leave, the change was obvious. Her posture straighter, her eyes clear and bright, and she hugged Jacob with a fierce intensity that spoke of gratitude beyond words. Her nightmares stopped that night, her parents later reported, replaced by dreams of traveling through stars on the back of a gentle bear made of light. This became a pattern over the following months. Jacob would identify people who needed something the dark room could provide. Children and adults alike who were stuck in some way, unable to see past their immediate reality to the larger truth that would free them. Not all of them saw the star bear, some saw other things. Loved ones who had passed, versions of themselves they could become. Sometimes just patterns of light that somehow answered questions they hadn't known how to ask. But all of them left changed, carrying with them a seed of wonder that would grow in its own time, spreading the recognition that the world was far more than the narrow slice of reality most people agreed to see. Ethan's photography during this period became increasingly experimental, though that word didn't quite capture what he was doing. He had begun taking pictures of things that shouldn't be visible, the spaces between moments, the light that existed in darkness, the connections between people who had never met. His camera became less a tool for capturing images and more a translator, converting the invisible language of connection into something the human eye could process. One series, titled The Space Between Heartbeats, showed what appeared to be empty rooms, but viewers consistently reported seeing movement in their peripheral vision while looking at them. Glimpses of figures that vanished when looked at directly, but left behind a feeling of presence, of being accompanied by something benevolent and patient. The scientific community had begun to take notice of the strange phenomena surrounding the family's work, though their investigations consistently failed to find any explanation that fit within conventional physics. One physicist from MIT spent a week studying Ethan's photographs with every instrument available, finally concluding that the images contained information at a quantum level that shouldn't be possible to capture with a conventional camera. When pressed for an explanation, she could only shrug and say that either the laws of physics were incomplete, which they already knew to be true, or something was happening that transcended physical laws entirely, which was a possibility she wasn't quite ready to embrace professionally, but couldn't dismiss personally. Lily's latest project pushed the boundaries even further. She had begun painting with materials that shouldn't work as paint. Starlight caught in water during meteor showers, dust from the darkroom floor mixed with conventional oils, even, in one memorable instance, tears of joy collected from viewers of her previous works. The resulting painting seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, showing different images depending on the viewer's state of mind, the time of day, even the weather outside. One collector swore his Lily Morgan painting had saved his life, showing him an image of a car accident the morning of the day it would have happened, causing him to take a different route to work and avoid the multi-car pileup that occurred exactly where and when he would have been. Jacob's role in all of this was becoming clearer as he matured. He wasn't meant to be an artist like his parents, but something else. A connector. A translator between the world of wonder they'd glimpsed and the everyday world most people inhabited. He had a gift for finding the right words to help people understand experiences that existed beyond language, for creating bridges between the impossible and the accepted. His school essays had begun circulating beyond his teachers, shared in online forums dedicated to consciousness studies and quantum philosophy, though always with skepticism, until people met him in person and felt the quiet authority that came not from knowledge, but from direct experience of truths most people only theorized about. The 15th anniversary of the Star Bear's visit approached with a sense of anticipation that none of them could quite explain. Jacob, now 16, had been having dreams that he described as downloads, receiving information about something coming. Not dangerous, but significant. A deepening of the connection that had been established all those years ago. He spent more time in the darkroom, sometimes emerging with drawings that looked like technical diagrams for machines that couldn't exist, sometimes with poetry that made readers feel like they were falling upward into infinite space, sometimes with nothing but a smile that suggested he'd been having conversations with old friends who existed outside the normal flow of time. 3 days before the anniversary, packages began arriving at the studio, sent from addresses that didn't exist, containing photographs and artworks from around the world. Each piece showed evidence of the Star Bear or something like it, creatures of light appearing in the margins of reality, always at moments of transformation or awakening. A photographer from Japan sent images of a fox made of aurora borealis dancing above Mount Fuji. A painter from Brazil contributed a canvas showing children playing with a jaguar whose spots were actually tiny galaxies. A child from Norway had drawn a whale made of northern lights singing to the stars. Each piece fit perfectly into a pattern none of them had seen until all the pieces were assembled, creating a map of wonder that spanned the globe. On the anniversary night itself, they gathered in the studio as they had every year, but this time they weren't alone. Sarah was there, along with a dozen others Jacob had helped over the years, people who had seen through the veil and couldn't go back to pretending the world was smaller than it was. They arranged themselves in a circle in the main studio space, the darkroom door open so the red light spilled out like a visible heartbeat. Nobody spoke, nobody needed to. They all felt the building energy, the sense that something was about to shift, that the next phase of whatever had begun 15 years ago was about to commence. At exactly midnight, the time when Ethan had first discovered the Star Bear in his darkroom, everything changed. The photograph on the wall didn't just glow, it projected, filling the room with a three-dimensional map of light that showed not just Earth, but the entire cosmos, all of it connected by threads of consciousness that pulsed with life. And there, at every intersection point, was a creature of light. Bears and foxes and whales and dragons and beings that had no earthly equivalent, all of them ambassadors of the same truth, that consciousness wasn't produced by matter but was the fundamental fabric from which matter arose, and that wonder wasn't a response to the universe but the universe recognizing itself. Jacob stood in the center of the projection, his body becoming translucent, revealing that he too was made of these threads of light, had always been, they all were, but he had learned to see it, to be it consciously rather than unconsciously. He spoke then, but not with his voice, with the same rumbling resonance the Star Bear had produced, a sound that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the soul. He said, though said wasn't the right word, shared might be better, that this was just the beginning, that humanity was approaching a moment of choice, to remain asleep to its true nature, or to wake up to the reality that they were all part of something infinitely beautiful and interconnected. The projection lasted for hours, though time seemed to have stopped or become irrelevant. Each person present experienced something different yet connected, some traveling to distant stars, some diving deep into the quantum foam where particles danced in and out of existence, some simply sitting in perfect peace, feeling for the first time in their lives completely held by a universe that wasn't cold and empty, but warm and full of presence. When it finally faded, when the room returned to normal, or what passed for normal in a studio where wonder had taken up permanent residence, They all knew something had changed, not just in them but in the world itself. A door had been opened that couldn't be closed. A truth had been spoken that couldn't be unheard. In the days that followed, reports came in from around the world of similar gatherings, similar projections, all happening at the exact same moment, all sharing the same message in different forms suited to different cultures and contexts. The Star Bear and its kin had appeared simultaneously to hundreds, maybe thousands of people, all of whom were ready to see, ready to be part of the next phase of human evolution, which wasn't biological but consciousness-based, a recognition of what had always been true, but hidden beneath layers of forgetting. The mainstream media tried to report on it, but couldn't find the right frame, calling it everything from mass hallucination to alien contact, missing the point that it was neither and both, and so much more. Ethan's photographs from that night shouldn't have existed. His camera hadn't been able to capture light that wasn't quite light, but when he developed the film, the images were there, showing not what had happened, but what it had meant, the moment when humanity began to remember its true nature. The photographs would become his most important work, not because they were his best technically, but because they served as activation codes for those who were ready to see, each viewing potentially triggering the same awakening that had happened in the studio that night. Galleries fought to display them, but Ethan was careful, knowing that forcing evolution never worked, that each person had to come to the truth in their own time. Lily's paintings after that night transcended art entirely, becoming what she called presence portraits, images that somehow contained the actual presence of what she painted, not representations but windows or doorways. When she painted the Star Bear from memory, people standing before the canvas reported feeling that familiar rumbling purr, some even claiming to feel fur beneath their fingers when they reached out to touch the paint. Her portrait of Jacob at 16, standing in the light projection, became famous not for its technical excellence, but for its effect on viewers, many of whom reported that looking at it was like having a conversation with someone who understood them completely, who saw their true nature and reflected it back with perfect love. Jacob himself changed the most after that night, though change wasn't quite the right word. Revealed might be better. He no longer quite fit in the normal world, not because he was strange, but because he was too real, too present, too clearly what everyone could be if they remembered how. He finished high school early, not because he was in a hurry, but because the traditional educational system had nothing left to offer him, and began traveling, appearing wherever groups were gathering to explore consciousness and connection. Never teaching in the traditional sense, but simply being present in a way that helped others remember their own knowing. The studio became even more of a pilgrimage site, but now it was just one node in a global network of places where the veil was thin, where the Star Bears and their kin had left permanent impressions on reality. People would travel from site to site like modern pilgrims, not seeking salvation but recognition, not looking for God outside themselves but remembering the divine nature of their own consciousness. The dark room photograph had evolved into something that defied description, showing different things to each viewer but always exactly what they needed to see, always with that sense of being seen in return by something vast and loving and patient. 20 years after the first visit, when Jacob was 21 and had become something between a teacher and a force of nature, he returned to the studio with news. He had been traveling in Tibet, he said, though his parents suspected he meant traveling in consciousness rather than physically, and had met others like himself, humans who had been touched by the Star Bears or similar beings and had grown into bridges between worlds. They were planning something, not an organization or movement in the traditional sense, but a deepening of the network, a strengthening of the connections that would make it easier for others to wake up to the truth of their nature. The plan, if it could be called that, was simple and complex simultaneously. Those who had been awakened would create art, music, literature, architecture, gardens, anything that could carry the frequency of wonder, seeding the world with reminders of what was possible. Not propaganda or proselytizing, but simple presence, beauty that pointed beyond itself to the source of all beauty, creativity that reminded others of their own creative nature. It would be subtle, patient, working on the level of consciousness rather than trying to convince minds that were locked in old patterns. And at the center of it all would be the recognition that had come through the Star Bear's visit, that separation was an illusion, that everything was connected, that wonder wasn't childish, but was perhaps the most mature response to a universe made of consciousness exploring itself through infinite forms. Ethan and Lily continued their work, their art becoming ever more refined, ever more effective at triggering recognition in those who were ready. They aged, but gracefully, carrying a light in their eyes that spoke of secrets too beautiful for words. The studio remained their base, but their influence spread far beyond its walls. Their work appearing in unexpected places, sometimes mysteriously. Copies of photographs appearing in hospitals and schools and prisons. Paintings manifesting in homes where someone was struggling with grief or depression. Always at just the right moment. Always with just the right image to remind someone that they were part of something larger and more beautiful than they'd dared imagine. The Star Bear itself appeared less frequently as the years passed. Not because it had withdrawn, but because it was no longer needed in the same way. Its purpose had been to crack open the door, to show what was possible, to plant seeds that would grow in their own time. Now, those seeds were forests. Those cracks had become doorways, and wonder was spreading like a benevolent virus through human consciousness, helped along by all those who had been touched by the creatures of light and had said yes to becoming bridges themselves. Sometimes, though, on quiet nights in the dark room, Ethan would feel that familiar presence, that rumbling purr that existed below sound, and he would smile, knowing that the friend who had changed everything was still there, still watching, still patiently helping humanity remember its true nature. As Jacob entered his mid-20s, his work took on a new dimension. He had begun what he called consciousness photography, though it involved no camera. He would sit with people and somehow help them see the light patterns that surrounded them, the connections that linked them to everything else, the beauty of their own consciousness made visible. These sessions were transformative, people emerging with a permanent shift in perception, able to see the subtle realms that had always been there, but hidden behind the consensus reality that most people agreed to inhabit. He never charged for these sessions, saying that you couldn't put a price on helping someone remember who they really were, and the universe always provided what he needed through mysterious means, anonymous donations, unexpected gifts, synchronicities that ensured he could continue his work. The scientific community had largely given up trying to explain the phenomena surrounding the family and others like them, though a few brave researchers continued to study what they called anomalous consciousness events. One team from Princeton discovered that areas where Star Bear sightings had occurred showed measurable changes in local physics, tiny but consistent variations in the behavior of random number generators, subtle shifts in electromagnetic fields, even changes in the rate of radioactive decay. They couldn't explain it, but they could document it, providing hard data that something real was happening, even if that something existed outside current scientific understanding. Lily's final major work before she retired from public exhibitions was a room-sized installation called The Development. It recreated the darkroom from that first night, but when viewers entered, they didn't see the recreation. They experienced their own version of the Star Bear visit, each person encountering exactly the teacher or guide or moment of wonder they needed. Some saw deceased loved ones. Some saw their future selves. Some saw creatures of impossible beauty. Some simply experienced a peace so profound they wept for hours afterward. The installation traveled the world for 3 years, leaving a trail of transformation in its wake, before finally returning to the studio where it belonged, where it continues to wait for those who are ready to remember.